The holding cell on Deck 7 smelled like ozone and old fear. Mara Vasquez had been in worse places. She'd been pinned under 200 kilos of collapsed tunnel in the Ganymede expansion, and she'd eaten ration paste for 11 days straight while waiting for a rescue shuttle that arrived on day 12. She'd survived a decompression incident that took 3 of her crewmates and left her with a scar along her left collarbone shaped vaguely like a question mark. A scar she'd had for 9 years and had stopped noticing most mornings, except when the light caught it a certain way or someone looked at it too long. The way the young security officer had looked at it when they stripped her utility belt before putting her in here. She was not, by any reasonable metric, easily rattled. But this was new. She pressed her back against the far wall of the holding cell and watched the alien princess sit perfectly still in the center of the room with her hands folded in her lap, and she tried to figure out how to play the next few minutes. The cell was 6 meters by 4, smooth gray composite walls. 1 door, sealed, no visible mechanism on this side. A ventilation strip along the ceiling emitted a faint hum that varied in pitch just enough to notice. 2 sleeping mats had been laid out on opposite sides of the room with the deliberate symmetry of someone trying to communicate neutrality, the kind of careful arrangement that said, "We have not decided anything yet about either of you." There was a water dispenser, a waste alcove, and nothing else. No windows, no comms panel, no table, nothing that could be used as leverage or weapon or tool, or so whoever designed this room had believed. The alien princess had not moved in 40 minutes. Mara cleared her throat. The princess's eyes shifted toward her. They were amber, with vertical pupils that contracted slightly in the cell's steady light. Her face was what Mara's mother would have called heartbreaking, high-boned, precise, with a quality of stillness that wasn't calm so much as it was controlled. She wore robes that had started out formal and were now somewhat disheveled from whatever had happened before they were both put in this room. A smear of something dark, not blood, something with a faintly iridescent quality, like oil on a deep-sea surface, ran along her jaw. Her hair was arranged in the formal style Mara had seen on Velithi diplomats at summits, pinned with 2 long clips that caught the overhead light. One of them was slightly askew. "You're Velithi," Mara said, not a question. Yes, her standard was perfect. Most of the imperial family spoke it. Mara had been told this at the orientation for human operators working the inner lanes. "And you are human." "Also yes. I am Princess Siravan of the 3rd House of Valeth." A pause that contained the particular texture of someone accustomed to names landing with weight, assessing whether this one had. "In case that matters to you." "It probably should," Mara said. "I'm Mara Vasquez. I was a cargo inspector before this morning. I have no idea why I'm here." Something shifted in the princess's expression. Not softening, it was more like a reassessment, a recalibration. She studied Mara for a long moment with those amber eyes, taking in the worn work jacket, the utility belt that had been stripped of everything except the belt itself, the scar along the collarbone where the neckline of Mara's shirt didn't quite cover it, the practical boots with their reinforced toes, the grease stain on Mara's right sleeve that hadn't quite come out in the last laundry cycle. Whatever she was calculating, she reached the end of it. "I know why you're here," the princess said. Mara waited. "They believe you were present when Ambassador Gokarath died." The name landed like a stone in still water. Mara heard it and felt the ripples move outward through everything she thought she knew about the last 6 hours of her life. Ambassador Gokarath. The Great Frog, they called him in the trading corridors, not to his face, never to his face, but universally, and with a kind of awed affection that you didn't usually find attached to ambassadors. He was enormous, even by Velithi standards, with the broad flat features of the old coastal clans, and a laugh that could be heard through 3 bulkheads and a sound-dampening partition. He'd been the one who brokered the Vega Corridor Agreement 14 years ago. He'd been the one who spent 18 months in careful negotiation with a human trade council that had every reason to distrust him, and had come away trusting him anyway, because he was the specific kind of being who made trust feel less like a risk and more like an inevitability. He'd been the reason Mara still had a job, because the Vega Corridor Agreement was the reason human cargo ships were allowed within the inner transit lanes at all, and the reason those lanes had the inspection protocols that made human operators viable rather than merely tolerated. He was 73 years old and in excellent health, and had been scheduled to give the opening address at the conclave this morning. "He's dead," Mara said. "Yes." "How?" The princess's hand, still folded, tightened slightly. The knuckles were pale against the darker skin. "They don't know, that is the problem." Mara looked at the sealed door, then back at the princess. She thought about the security officer's face when he'd escorted her in here. Not angry, not hostile, but careful, the face of someone following a protocol they weren't entirely sure about. "And they think I did it. They think one of us did it." Siravan's voice was measured, not toneless, measured, which was different, which meant something was being controlled. There were only two beings in proximity to the ambassador's private chambers in the hour before his body was discovered: you and me. I was doing a routine inspection of the cargo manifests on this deck. I had authorization. I was visiting the ambassador, the briefest pause. He was my great-uncle by the third consanguinity. Her eyes stayed on Mara's face. We were close. The word landed with weight. Mara absorbed it and didn't look away. "So they put us in a room together," she said. "They put us in a room together," the princess confirmed. The Conclave Security Division operates on the theory that if both potential suspects are isolated together, one will eventually say something incriminating in front of the other, or the guilty party will reveal themselves through behavior. That's a stupid theory. It is a theory designed by beings who have never actually felt fear, and who have therefore never understood how well fear can be managed. The princess uncurled her hands and laid them flat on her knees, a deliberate gesture that Mara would later learn was a Velithi signal of candor, of setting aside defensive posture. "I did not kill my great-uncle. I didn't kill him either." "I know." Mara blinked. "How?" "Because," Siravan said, with the particular quietness of someone speaking a thing that has been known for some time and is now simply being named, "I know who did." She didn't say it immediately. That was the thing about the Velithi. They had a deep and structural understanding of the importance of silence, the way a held moment could do more work than 100 words. Mara had learned this in the trading corridors, watching Velithi merchants work. She'd watched a senior trader once hold a silence for 45 seconds while a human buyer visibly fell apart, and she'd understood afterward that the silence had been the negotiation. The words were just the signature. So Mara sat down on her sleeping mat and waited. The princess rose. She moved with the particular economy of someone who had been trained since childhood to fill space without wasting it. A Velithi martial discipline, Mara knew, though she'd only ever seen fragments of it in practice. She walked to the water dispenser, drew 2 cups, and crossed the cell to offer one to Mara with both hands, which was the formal offering gesture. Mara took it with both hands because she'd been in enough rooms with Velithi to know that mattered. She drank. The water tasted slightly of minerals, which meant they were deep in the station's secondary plumbing system. Deck 7 was below the main concourse, and the secondary plumbing tended to pick up trace elements from the structural composite at this depth. 3 years ago, the princess said, returning to her position in the center of the room, Ambassador Gokarath began to suspect that someone within the Conclave's own administrative structure was funneling root data to independent operators outside the treaty zones. She did not sit. She stood with her feet slightly apart, perfectly balanced, and Mara would understand later that this wasn't posture but readiness, the kind of readiness that had been trained in rather than adopted for effect. He did not go to the security division. He came to me. Why you? Because I was the only member of the third house who had both the clearance and the specific skill set required to investigate quietly. A very faint movement at the corner of her mouth that might have been the ghost of dry amusement. Also because he trusted me, and because I was, in his words, difficult to kill. He sounds like someone worth knowing. He was. Something crossed her face, not grief, not yet. Grief was being held in abeyance by necessity, by the simple fact that there was work to do and grief would slow the work. He was the best of us. He believed that the treaty with humanity was not a concession but an opportunity. That two species with fundamentally different approaches to problem solving could accomplish things together that neither could accomplish separately. There are not many among the houses who share that view. How many of them are trying to undo the treaty? She looked at Mara steadily. More than the records would suggest, fewer than the rhetoric implies. Mara filed that away. What did he find? She asked. You and he, what did you find? What we found, the princess corrected, with an emphasis that was not correction for its own sake but something more like insistence on precision. Over 18 months of investigation was a network. Not large, 4 individuals. 2 of them hold positions within the security division itself. One is a senior route analyst for the Inner Corridor Authority, and one, she paused, is a member of the Conclave's own ceremonial guard. His name is Tarven. He has served in his role for 11 years. He is trusted. He should not be. The guard that should have been outside his chambers this morning. The guard that was not outside his chambers this morning. Siravan's voice was very quiet, because he arranged to be elsewhere, and the logs will have been adjusted to show he was present for the full shift. It is a thing these 4 do well, the adjustment of records. They have been doing it for 3 years. Mara looked at the sealed door again. She thought about what was on the other side of it. She thought about the fact that 2 of the 4 people who'd arranged this were in the same building, possibly on the same floor. They know we might figure it out. They know I already have figured it out. They know I was in my great-uncle's chambers this morning because I received a message from him the night before. He told me he was ready to move, that he had enough, that today he would formally present the evidence to the conclave. A pause. They intercepted the message, or someone who saw it reported its contents, and they moved first. And now you're in this cell. And I am in this cell. With a human cargo inspector who happened to be on the wrong deck at the wrong moment, and who is now, from the perspective of the people who killed my great-uncle, usefully contained alongside me. Her amber eyes were steady. They do not believe you know anything. They believe you are incidental. That makes you, potentially, useful in a way they have not calculated for. Mara sat with that for a moment. So the plan they've made for us, she said, is that we wait here while the evidence disappears, the logs get adjusted, and the 4 people responsible walk away. And they get to keep doing whatever they've been doing to the root data. That is the plan they have made for us, yes. I don't like that plan. Neither do I. The princess looked at her with something that was beginning to look less like assessment and more like alliance, which is why I need your help. The first thing Mara noticed about the cell, really noticed, the way you notice things when your brain shifts from processing shock to processing problem, was the ventilation strip. It ran the full length of the ceiling, about 15 centimeters wide. Standard station ventilation architecture for a deck this far below the main concourse would route it through the secondary maintenance network. She knew this because she'd been inspecting cargo infrastructure for 11 years and had spent more time than she'd like to remember working out the plumbing and ventilation logic of stations at various depths. The secondary maintenance network, unlike the primary, was not monitored in real time. It was checked manually, on a rotation that on a station this size would run approximately 4 hours between passes. The second thing she noticed was that the composite wall panels were the older Type 6 installation. She knew because the seam pattern was distinctive, a slightly wider gap at the vertical joins, with a particular bevel at the lower corners that indicated the modular mounting system rather than the newer bonded construction. Type 6 panels could be unclipped from the underlying frame without tools if you knew where the release points were and were willing to work patiently with your fingernails. She had long fingernails. She'd always kept them that way because they were useful in exactly this category of situation, which most people never encountered, and which she had encountered more than seemed statistically likely. The third thing she noticed was that the princess had been watching her notice these things without comment, with a quality of attention that felt less like curiosity and more like the confirmation of a hypothesis. "Tell me about your great-uncle's chambers," Mara said, "specifically the layout." A sitting room, a sleeping alcove, a private study. The study connected to the formal meeting space through a sliding partition. The study was his working space. He did not like to work in the formal meeting space. He said the furniture was designed to make everyone feel slightly uncomfortable, which he considered an unacceptable condition for honest thought. Security feeds. Standard coverage in all rooms. However, a pause. My great-uncle had a practice that the security division was aware of and accommodated. On the evenings before major conclave events, he would request that the interior feeds in the study be suspended for a period of 2 hours. He said it was to allow him to prepare his remarks in private without the sense of being observed. The princess paused. It was actually to allow him to work on sensitive documents without creating a record that would be accessible to anyone who might later have reason to look for one. When was the last suspension window? Last night, from the 20th hour to the 22nd. And when was he found? The 7th hour this morning, by the cleaning staff. Mara did the math. 9 hours between the end of the suspension window and discovery. That's plenty of time to arrange a scene. She looked at the ceiling strip, measuring it with her eyes. The documents he was going to present, where would he have kept them? He would not have kept them on station systems. He was too careful for that and too familiar with the habits of the people he was investigating. They had access to station records. This? Siravan's eyes moved, tracking something internal, some sequence of recall. He had a device, very small, a personal archive unit, old technology, nothing networked. He wore it beneath his robes against his skin. She touched a point just below her own collarbone. He showed it to me once, years ago, told me it was the place he kept the things that mattered most. Her hand stayed there for a moment. I assumed he meant sentimental things, photographs, letters from old colleagues. He was that kind of man. Was it on his body when he was found? I don't know. I was placed in this cell before I could determine that. Mara stood up. She walked to the near wall and began running her fingers along the seams between the panels, methodically, starting from the lower left corner and working across. Type 6. The release points were set at the lower corners of each panel, recessed by about 2 millimeters, designed so they could be reached by a maintenance tool but not accidentally triggered by a hand brushing the wall. They were not designed to resist a fingernail applied with patience and specific directional pressure. "What are you doing?" the princess asked. "Finding us a way out of here." Mara kept her eyes on the wall, her fingers working. "And then we're going to get to your great-uncle's quarters before the people who killed him do." The security division. 2 of the 4 people who killed him work for the security division, which means there are people in that division who don't know what happened this morning. Investigators who are trying to work this in good faith and don't have the information they need. She found the first release point and pressed. It gave a millimeter. If we can get to the archive unit before the 4 of them do and get it to someone clean in the division. You would need to know who is clean and who is not. You know the names of the 4. You've been investigating them for 3 years. Yes. Then you know who to avoid. which means you know, by subtraction, who to go to. The princess was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than her previous silences. Not the careful holding of information, but the consideration of a path not yet taken. "You are very direct," she said. "I've been told that." Mara pressed the second release point on the lower panel. The seam widened by a fraction. "Is it a problem?" "No." Something eased in Siravan's voice, not quite relaxed, but different, some long-held tension acknowledging, at least provisionally, that it did not have to be held by her alone. "It is actually quite useful." The ventilation shaft was not comfortable. It was not designed for comfort. It was designed for conditioned air, and it achieved that function adequately while offering approximately 60 centimeters of vertical clearance and a surface texture that felt like grated metal against Mara's palms. She moved through it on her elbows and knees with the unhappy efficiency of someone who had once spent 3 hours in a service crawlspace, rerouting a coolant line on a freighter in the outer lanes, while her supervisor talked at her through a comms link about documentation requirements. She had learned to be small in tight spaces. She had learned to keep her breathing controlled, and her mind on the physical problem immediately in front of her, rather than on the various larger problems that existed in the world outside the shaft. Behind her, the princess moved with a silence that was genuinely unnerving. No scrape of knees against the metal ridging. No sharp intake of breath when the shaft turned at an awkward angle. No sound at all, really, just a quality of presence at Mara's back that she felt more than heard, steady and close. "Left at the junction," Siravan said softly. Her voice was low and even. "There will be a secondary branch approximately 12 meters further that we should not take. It routes to the waste processing systems." "You've been in these shafts before." "I studied the station's infrastructure schematics before the conclave began. The maintenance network layout is part of standard security assessment." A pause. "My great-uncle's chambers are on Deck 5. We need to reach the central lift column and ascend 2 levels without being observed." "How long before they notice we're gone?" "The manual check rotation for this section of the station is every 4 hours. We have—" A brief pause. Mara imagined the princess updating a calculation she had certainly already run multiple times. "Perhaps 2 hours and 15 minutes, possibly more if the officers responsible for checking are involved in other aspects of this morning's situation." 2 hours is plenty." "You say that with remarkable confidence for someone currently crawling through a ventilation system on a foreign station." "I've been in worse situations." Mara reached the left junction and turned, angling her shoulders to fit the narrower passage. The hum of the ventilation system was louder here, a low, constant vibration that moved through the metal all around them, which would make it harder to hear anything outside and would also make it harder to be heard. "You said your great-uncle trusted you, that he came to you because you had specific skills." "Yes." "What skills?" This pause was different from the princess's previous ones. Not evasion, she was past evasion, or past the version of it that was about Mara specifically. This was the consideration of how much to say and in what form. "Before I was appointed to my current role within the Third House's diplomatic structure," Siravan said, "I spent 7 years in the House Intelligence Service. Field operations primarily. Information recovery, surveillance, infiltration of compromised networks." A pause. "And on occasion, when it was determined to be necessary, the management of direct threats." Mara processed this. "So you're telling me you're trained to do exactly what we're about to do?" "I am telling you that I am not solely a decorative diplomatic figure, and that this situation, while severe, is not entirely outside my competence to manage." A pause. "I am also telling you that 7 years was some time ago, and that field work atrophies without practice, and that I have not been permitted to practice in 3 years because my current role is considered incompatible with active field status." "Who decided that?" The first and second houses, collectively. They have strong opinions about what the third princess should and should not be doing with her time. Her voice was flat. My great-uncle was the one who arranged my original placement in the intelligence service over their objections. He said that a member of the house with neither combat training nor field experience was a liability in a world that had not become as safe as the houses preferred to believe. He was right. He was consistently right about things that the houses did not wish to hear, which was one reason they considered him eccentric and another reason they considered him invaluable. Something moved through her voice that was not grief yet but was its precursor, the particular quality of a loss that hasn't been fully allowed yet but is present in everything anyway, like a frequency just below hearing. He told me, when I was placed in my current role, that he was sorry. That he had not been able to protect that part of my life for me. I told him it was all right. A pause. It was not entirely all right, but I understood why it had happened. These things are political. Mara moved through the shaft and thought about a man who had spent 50 years being right about things people didn't want to hear, and had kept going anyway. His name for you, she said. The Great Frog, where did that come from? Something in the quality of the silence behind her changed. It was a title he earned early in his career, Sci-Fi said. He was very young, and he was sent as a junior attaché to a trade negotiation that had been failing for 2 years. The human representatives were, he described them as immovable. They had a position and they held it, and they believed holding it was the same thing as strength. A pause. Studied them for 3 days before he said a single word in the session room. He watched how they moved, how they argued, what made them comfortable and what made them uneasy. And then he built his approach around everything they were not expecting, and he concluded the negotiation in 4 hours. Her voice was quiet and steady. His senior colleague at the time said that he had been like a great hunting frog, perfectly still, perfectly patient, and then suddenly somewhere entirely else. The name stayed. Mara thought about that. About the image of a young Velithi diplomat sitting still in a room full of difficult humans for 3 days, watching. He sounds like he understood people, she said. He understood that most people wanted to be met where they were rather than asked to go somewhere else first, and that if you could meet them where they were, genuinely, without condescension, they would walk considerable distances with you afterward. Another pause. He said that was true of all species, that it was the most universal thing he'd found in 50 years of working across the lines. They reached the access point Mara had been calculating for. She found the release on the interior panel and eased it open by 4 centimeters, enough to see through. The maintenance alcove on Deck 6 was empty. A service corridor ran parallel to the main throughway, lit in the warm amber of early morning cycle. She pushed the panel open and dropped through. They came out in a maintenance alcove on Deck 6, 1 level above their destination. The alcove opened onto a service corridor that ran parallel to the main throughway. It was still early morning by the station's simulated cycle. The lights had just shifted from their cool night blue to the warmer amber of the morning stage, and the service corridor was empty of everything except the faint hum of the station going about its pre-dawn business. Mara replaced the ventilation cover and turned to look at the princess. Standing up in motion rather than sitting in controlled stillness, Sci-Fi was different than she'd been in the cell, not different in kind but in degree, the same qualities made larger. She was taller than Mara had registered. The formal robes, despite their dishevelment, still carried the weight of what they were. She held herself with that particular balanced readiness, and she was already scanning the corridor with an efficiency that had nothing decorative about it. The iridescent smear on her jaw caught the amber light. "Cameras on the main concourse level," the princess said, her voice pitched just above silence. "And the ambassador's suite will have a token security presence, regardless of how the morning's events have been arranged. We will not be able to avoid all of it." "There's a monitored crossing we have to pass through," Mara said. "I saw it on the schematics in the cargo manifest systems. Deck 5 Central, 30 meters of open corridor under camera coverage. Yes, Siravan looked at her. I have a solution for the 30 meters. What kind of solution? The corner of her mouth, the thing that might become a smile and kept stopping just short of it. The kind that requires me to be very visible and very authoritative and very much not where anyone is expecting me to be. The crossing at Deck 5 Central was covered by 2 fixed cameras and staffed by 2 junior security officers who were, at this hour, engaged in the particular kind of alert watchfulness that comes from knowing you're supposed to be alert, but not having anything specific to be alert about. The princess walked directly into the covered zone. Mara, watching from the service corridor entrance, gave her a 4-second head start and then moved. What followed was a performance that Mara, in her 11 years of dealing with stations, ports, customs officers, inspectors, and the full range of beings who inhabited the infrastructure of interstellar trade, had never seen executed quite like this. Siravan announced herself clearly. Name, title, house, the formal triad of identification that Velithi Royal Protocol required when approaching an officer of any security body. She then asked, with the precise and pointed courtesy of someone who had grown up in rooms full of beings with more institutional power than her, and had learned to occupy space anyway, exactly what the security division's current evidence processing timeline looked like for the chambers of the late Ambassador Gokareth. Both officers went rigid. Not afraid, something more specific than fear, the particular response of people who have been trained for one thing and are suddenly facing something entirely outside their training, which was a third Princess of Valeth addressing them directly about an active death investigation, with the authority of someone who had every right to ask, and the bearing to suggest that the answer had better be good. Mara walked through the zone in 12 seconds. She was 20 meters down the service corridor on the far side before either officer had said anything in response to the princess. The service entrance to the ambassador's suite was not locked. This was a detail that told Mara something important before she'd gone 3 steps inside. A locked door meant security consciousness, meant care, meant someone protecting a perimeter. An unlocked service entrance meant someone had moved through it in a hurry and hadn't stopped to secure it behind them. It meant urgency. It meant they were behind the curve, but perhaps not irretrievably so. The sitting room was undisturbed. The sleeping alcove, Mara checked it first, quickly, doing a visual sweep, was undisturbed. The formal meeting space with its uncomfortable furniture was undisturbed. The study was not undisturbed. Mara stood in the doorway and took it in. Drawers pulled open. Panels along the wall that had been levered away from their mountings and not replaced. A data terminal whose casing had been cracked with something flat and hard, its innards exposed, and the storage units pulled. Filing systems opened and emptied onto the floor in a scatter of physical documents that someone had evidently decided weren't worth reading carefully. The search had been fast and had not been careful and had, she suspected, been unsuccessful. The room had the quality of a place that had been torn through by someone increasingly frustrated with what they weren't finding. She thought about the archive unit, old technology, not networked, worn against the skin. She thought about where a man kept things that mattered most. She crossed back to the sleeping alcove, went to the bed. It had been made by the cleaning staff, but not with the particular precision of the ambassador's personal habits. She'd never met him, but she knew his reputation for meticulousness from the cargo operators who'd worked under his treaty's protocols, and the sheet at the right corner was slightly loose in a way that suggested the cleaner had been working quickly when they heard others in the corridor. She crouched. The archive unit was pressed against the wall beneath the bed frame, half behind the mounting bracket, small enough to be overlooked by anyone doing a standing search or even a crouching one who wasn't looking specifically for it. A flat disc the size of her palm. Matte surface, No active indicators, nothing transmitting. It was invisible to passive scans, because there was nothing to detect. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She heard a sound. Not from the corridor. From the study, the particular quality of a footstep that had tried to be quiet and hadn't quite managed it. The subtle difference between an empty room and a room with a being in it who was trying not to be noticed. Mara was already in motion when the door to the sleeping alcove opened. She went low, behind the bed frame, into the corner where the wall met the floor and the light was worst. The being who came through was Velithi, male, dressed in the dark formal uniform of the Conclave Ceremonial Guard. He was large, even for Velithi. He moved with the assurance of someone who had not expected to find anyone here, and was very rapidly revising his plans. He hadn't seen her yet. She had approximately 2 seconds. She had the archive unit in her left hand. She had her right hand in her jacket pocket, which still contained the water cup from the cell, because she'd pocketed it without thinking when the princess handed it to her. Pure habit. 11 years of keeping every container because you never knew when you'd need one. She stood up and threw the cup. It hit him between the nose and the upper lip. Not hard enough to damage. She wasn't trying to damage. She was trying to disrupt, to interrupt the reaching motion of his hands by a fraction of a second, to create a moment of surprise where a moment of surprise was worth more than all the planning in the world. It worked. His hands went to his face. She went sideways along the far wall, around the end of the bed, through the door to the study, and she was running before he'd finished processing what had happened. She was in the corridor before he came out of the alcove. She was 20 meters down the corridor before she heard the suite door open behind her. She took 2 turns, a stairwell, a maintenance alcove where she pressed herself flat in the dark, and counted her own heartbeats with the specific kind of calm that was not actually calm, but was calm's close and functional cousin. Footsteps, moving fast and not particularly quiet, which meant he was past trying to be subtle. They passed the alcove, continued, got quieter. Silence. She breathed. She confirmed the archive unit was still in her hand, gripped so hard her knuckles ached, and she made herself loosen the grip, and she breathed again. A water cup, she thought. She had stopped a trained ceremonial guard, a man who had been serving in his role for 11 years and had presumably been through considerable field training in that time, with a water cup and muscle memory. She thought about what the princess had said, about the great frog, about perfectly still, and then suddenly somewhere entirely else. She went to find Sira Van. She found her where she'd expected, working her way back along the service corridor route, moving with that characteristic silence that had gone from unnerving to reassuring somewhere between the cell and the ventilation shaft. The princess saw the archive unit in Mara's hand before Mara had said a word, and something crossed her face that was the first genuinely unguarded thing Mara had seen from her. It was brief, half a second at most. Then the control came back. But Mara had seen it. He kept it under the bed frame, Mara said. Of course he did. The princess took the unit with both hands, and the steadiness of that grip was clearly costing her something. She turned it over. Her thumb found a small indentation along the edge. He showed me this once, years ago. He called it his vault, a pause that contained everything. He said the things that mattered most deserved to be kept close. Her thumb pressed the indentation and held. The device emitted a low tone and a panel slid open. Inside, nested in a protective lining, a cluster of data chips no larger than Mara's thumbnail, each labeled in precise Velithi script. Is that, Mara started? Everything. The princess closed the device and held it in both hands for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were steady in the way of something that has found what it needed and is now very clear about what comes next. 3 years of work, names, transaction records, route diversion logs, testimony captured from sources who were not aware they were being documented, communications. A pause. Enough. Rodalan, Mara said. The princess looked at her. You mentioned her, Mara said. When you were naming the people in the division, you didn't name her as one of the four. She was my great-uncle's choice, Sci-Fi said. He trusted her completely. He told me, he said, if something happens to me, Rodalan is the one you go to. He had reasons, good ones. He explained them to me. She held the device. He planned for the possibility that something would happen to him. He was that kind of man. Then that's where we go. The princess looked at her steadily for a moment. The guard saw you, she said. He saw someone in work clothes in poor light. He didn't get a full look at my face. He will report it. Let him. Mara straightened her jacket. By the time that report reaches the two people in the division who care about it for the wrong reasons, we'll have put the archive unit in front of the one person who cares about it for the right ones. Sci-Fi studied her. She did it with the attention of someone who had spent years learning to read situations quickly and accurately, who had learned that the most important data in any negotiation was what people revealed when they didn't think they were revealing anything. You are calm, she said. I'm not, Mara said. I'm not calm at all, but I've found it works better to act calm. The problem tends to behave as if it's already solved. Something happened at the corner of Sci-Fi's mouth, arrived and stayed this time. My great-uncle called it confident water, she said quietly. He said the most important thing he'd ever learned about negotiation was to proceed as if the outcome you needed was already determined, and to believe it completely, so that everyone else in the room believed it before they had time to disagree. She looked down at the archive unit in her hands, at the handwriting on the data chips inside it, the small, precise Velithi script of a man who had spent 3 years building something he intended to last. He said water always found its way. It didn't force, it didn't announce itself, it simply proceeded. Mara thought about a ventilation shaft, about a water cup leaving her hand in the dimness of a sleeping alcove, about the way the archive unit had been right there, exactly where it needed to be, because a careful man had kept his most important things close. He would have liked you, the princess said. She said it simply, and she seemed to surprise herself with the simplicity of it, but she didn't take it back. He had a way of seeing what was actually in front of him, not what should be there or what protocol said was there. What was actually there. He did that with humans consistently when most of my people looked and saw something else. A pause. I used to think that was sentimentality. And now, Sci-Fi looked at her. Now I think that was the whole point, that it was never sentimentality. It was just accurate. Chief Investigator Rodalan arrived in the interview room 7 minutes after the request was made. She was older than Mara had expected, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had learned over a long career to show precisely what it chose to and nothing else. She looked at the princess. She looked at Mara. She looked at the archive unit on the table between them. She said Gokarth's name, not a question. She sat down, she folded her hands, she listened. 2 hours later, the 4 were detained. Mara learned this from the junior investigator assigned to take her statement, a young Velithi who took notes with the focused intensity of someone who understood they were in the middle of something that would define their career. When he was done, he looked up and said, carefully, that her unauthorized departure from the holding facility would require a determination by the chief investigator regarding charges. I understand, Mara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without looking up from his notes, my sister works a cargo vessel on the inner lanes. She's been doing it for 6 years, under the ambassador's protocols. Mara looked at him. I know, she said. He nodded. He went back to his notes. The princess came to find her in the secondary office, an hour after the detentions were confirmed. She still looked like someone who had been through something real. The iridescent smear was gone, and the formal hairpins had been straightened, but around her eyes there was a quality of exhaustion that the controlled posture couldn't entirely account for. She sat down without ceremony, without the quality of managed distance she'd had in the cell. "No charges," she said. "Exigent circumstances." "Good. Your employer has been notified. Your inspection work has been logged as complete and compensated." "You didn't have to do that." "No," she said, "I know." They sat with that for a moment. "I'm sorry about your gray tuncle," Mara said. The princess's hands were flat on her knees. The same position as the cell, but different. Not the locked stillness of someone holding themselves together by force. The gesture of someone who has done what needed to be done, and is now, carefully, beginning to allow themselves to know the full weight of what has been lost. "He died doing what he believed in," she said. "He spent 50 years believing that the way forward was together, not tolerance. He had no patience for tolerance. He said tolerance was a condescending form of distance. He meant partnership, real partnership, built on genuine recognition." She paused. "He thought the treaty with humanity was the most important thing that had happened in the quadrant in a century." A lot of people disagreed. A lot of people disagreed. The 4 who killed him disagreed most violently. They believed the inner lanes belonged solely to Velithi interests, and that an ambassador who spent his career arguing for shared space was an embarrassment. Her chin lifted. They were wrong about the lanes. They were also wrong about the outcome. She paused. "The evidence my gray tuncle spent 3 years building is in front of the bodies that will act on it. The network is exposed. The treaty stands. Confident water," she said quietly. "It always finds its way." Myra looked at the door. At the window beyond, where the station's main concourse was visible through the corridor glass. Busy now, full of the motion of the conclave reassembling itself around the morning's events, absorbing the shock the way large bodies absorb shocks, through dispersion and adaptation, and the slow reshaping of what had changed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "In the cell, you said you knew who did it. You had the names, the network, 3 years of investigation. Why did you need me?" Sierra Van was quiet for a moment, not the held silence of strategy, the simple pause of someone considering honesty. "I had the information," she said. "I did not have access." The chambers, the monitored corridor, the investigator who needed to receive the evidence, those required a level of operational flexibility that I could not achieve alone while maintaining the appearance that we were still contained. She paused, and I needed someone whose presence in the ambassador's private quarters would be explicable as coincidental, someone not recognized, not flagged, not on any list of people who should be watched. A pause. Someone who would take a wall apart from the inside rather than wait to be released, and would do it calmly, and would outrun a ceremonial guard with a water cup. Mara looked at her. "You planned this in the cell, while you were sitting there not moving." "I planned as much as I could with the information available to me." A pause. "The cup was improvised." "It worked." "It worked." The corner of her mouth, fully committed this time. "My gray tuncle would have found that very funny. He had a great fondness for solutions that were simpler than the problem seemed to deserve. He used to say that the universe had a preference for economy, and that anyone who forgot that was going to spend a great deal of their life working harder than necessary." "He sounds like he would have been good company." "The best I've known." The grief came through now fully, without the armor of necessity holding it back. She let it show and did not apologize for it. It lasted a moment, and then it was held alongside everything else. Not gone, never going to be gone, but folded into the ongoing work of being the person she was going to have to be now that he wasn't there to argue with the houses for her. "The conclave will need testimony from both of us," she said, "over the coming days. I'll be here. My inspection is technically complete, but I can extend my station authorization. Chief Investigator Rodolon has suggested that the Conclave's liaison office might have interest in a human inspector with demonstrated operational judgment under complex circumstances." A pause. I may have made a representation on your behalf." Mara looked at her. "What kind of representation?" "The accurate kind." Siravan straightened her robes. The formal quality was back, but different, chosen, not assumed, the difference between armor worn by necessity and armor worn by preference. "My great-uncle spent his career building bridges. I intend to continue that work. It will require a variety of skills, some of which I do not personally possess, and some of which I have just watched a cargo inspector deploy with a water cup in a sleeping alcove." Myra stood. The question mark scar caught the office light for a moment. "I'm a cargo inspector," she said. "You are a person who took a composite wall apart from the inside rather than wait to be released," Siravan said. "I find that a more relevant qualification." She held out her hand, palm upward. The Velithi offering gesture, between equals, not ceremony, something more than ceremony, the acknowledgement that a thing had been done together that neither could have done alone. Mara put her hand in it. The grip was brief and firm and real. Then the princess released her and walked to the door and paused there, in the frame, and looked back. "Go-Karth used to say," she said, "that the most dangerous thing in any room was a human who had decided what was going to happen." "He sounds like he knew us." "He did." Something moved across her face, the grief, the admiration, the particular quality of loving someone who is gone. "I am beginning to understand why." She left. Myra stood alone in the secondary office. She looked at the door. She looked at the window and the concourse beyond it, the ordinary busy motion of a station going about the ordinary business of existing, the same motion that had been happening all morning, while a man's evidence found its way to the right hands and a four-person network collapsed, and the inner lanes remained open, and the treaty remained standing, and the work continued. Confident water, she thought. She straightened her jacket and went out to meet whatever came next. The formal testimony sessions were held in one of the conclave's smaller chambers, not the grand hall where Go-Karth had been scheduled to speak, but a working room with a long table and 7 chairs, and the kind of lighting that made everyone look slightly tired. Mara attended 3 of them over the following 2 days. She sat in a chair that was designed for Velithi proportions, and was therefore too wide and slightly too deep, and made her feel, each time, like a child sitting in an adult's furniture. She gave her account each time clearly and without embellishment, and she answered every question twice if it was asked twice, and she watched the investigators on the other side of the table listen to her with an attention that she suspected they did not give to all witnesses. The 3rd session was different from the first 2. The 3rd session included a junior analyst from the Root Authority who had found something in the data chips from the archive unit, a secondary layer of documentation that Go-Karth had compiled without Siravan's knowledge, a set of records pertaining not to the inner transit lanes, but to something larger, trade agreements, historical records of route negotiations going back 30 years. A pattern of incremental pressure on human operators that had never been illegal, but had never been entirely accidental either. The analyst laid it out on the table with the care of someone who understood what they were putting down. Ambassador Go-Karth documented this over 15 years, she said. He believed it was important for the record. That eventually someone would need to see how the pressure had been applied and where it had come from, and what it had been intended to accomplish. Mara looked at the documents. She thought about cargo operators she knew. She thought about her 11 years of working the inner lanes, of the inspection protocols that had always felt slightly more onerous than they needed to be, slightly more designed to create friction than to create safety, in ways that she'd absorbed as simply the cost of doing business because what else could you do? She thought about the freighter captain who'd lost her license 3 years ago over a documentation dispute that had seemed, at the time, like bad luck. "He never published any of this," said one of the senior investigators. "He was waiting until he had enough that publishing it couldn't be dismissed," said the analyst. He was waiting until the case was complete. A pause. He almost made it. Almost, Mara thought. The word sat in the room with the particular weight of things that are almost enough. But almost was not the end of the story. Almost was where the 3 years of work met the 2 days of what had come after, and the two combined were now in a document with the conclave seal on it, and the signatures of investigators who had no connection to the network that had tried to make sure it never saw the light. On the 3rd evening, the princess found her in the observation lounge on the upper level, which was the only place on the station that had windows facing the outside, the actual outside, space itself, the great dark with its spray of light that never got old no matter how many years you spent working among it. Mara had a cup of something hot that the dispenser had identified as tea adjacent, and she was sitting with her back to the room and her eyes on the stars, and she heard Sci-Fi come in before she saw her, because she had begun to learn the rhythm of the princess's footsteps in the past 2 days, their particular quality of silence that was different from most silences, that had something deliberate in it. She pulled a chair around and sat beside her, facing the window. For a while neither of them said anything. This was, Mara had learned, a comfortable thing with Sci-Fi, a thing that was allowed. Most people she knew found silence edgy, filled it with talk that was really just noise. The princess understood silence as a thing that could hold content without words. The root authority analyst is going to recommend a full review of the inner lane protocols, Sci-Fi said eventually, not announcing it, just placing it in the air between them. All of them, back 30 years, with human operators given standing to participate in the review process. That's a significant change. Yes, a pause. My great-uncle advocated for it for 20 years. He was told consistently that the time was not right. Now the time is right. Now the documentation exists, and the documentation is in front of people who cannot claim they haven't seen it. She looked at the stars. He used to say that he wasn't trying to change minds. He was trying to build the record that would matter when minds were ready to change. He said the hardest part of any transformation was not the argument but the patience. A pause. He had a great deal of patience, more than I do. He had 50 years to develop it. He had 50 years, and he spent every one of them working, not toward a conclusion. He was not the kind of person who worked toward conclusions, toward a direction, toward a world that was incrementally, undeniably, documentably different from the world he'd found when he started. She paused. He told me once that the victory he wanted was not a moment but a condition, a state of things that would persist after he was gone because he had built it carefully enough that it didn't need him anymore. Mara looked at the stars, at the old light traveling incomprehensible distances to arrive at her eyes, patient as water. He did that, she said. Yes, the word was simple and certain and heavy with everything it was carrying. He did that. They sat in the observation lounge, and the stars did what they always did, which was exist with perfect indifference to the debates and the documents and the testimonies, and the archive units kept close to the chest of a man who had believed, for 50 years, that the way forward was together. The stars had been there before any of it. They would be there long after. But the thing that had been built, the lanes, the treaties, the protocols, the pattern of relationships between species that had learned, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable difficulty, to share the corridors between the lights, that was not nothing. That was the specific kind of creation that outlasted individual lifetimes, because it had been woven into the ordinary business of existing, into the daily movement of cargo ships and inspectors and route analysts and diplomats, and the junior investigators who took notes with focused intensity, because they understood that what they were documenting mattered. He was right about humans, Mara said. Yes, said Sci-Fi. We're stubborn, Mara said. We don't stop. We keep going when it doesn't make sense to keep going. We throw cups. She paused. We take walls apart from the inside. He called it tenacity. He said it was the most specifically human thing he'd ever encountered and the most undervalued thing in the quadrant. The princess paused. He said the Velithi were patient, and the other old species were wise, and the younger ones were adaptable, and humans were tenacious in a way that none of the others had quite managed to develop, and that in the long run tenacity was what made things stick. Mara thought about this. About 11 years of cargo inspections and tight spaces and problems solved with whatever was available. About a ventilation shaft and a release point at a lower corner and a water cup already in her pocket. "I want to show you something," Sci-Fi said. She opened the archive unit on the table between them. Not the data chips, something else, in a separate compartment that Mara hadn't noticed before, smaller and separate from the rest. A folded piece of physical paper, which was unusual enough to be remarkable. "He wrote letters," the princess said. "Actual letters on paper, because he said that screens recorded everything and paper kept secrets." She unfolded it and held it so Mara could see, and Mara read the handwriting, large and slightly uneven, which she hadn't expected from a man described as meticulous, but which made a certain sense when you considered that meticulousness in documentation and looseness in personal correspondence were not mutually exclusive qualities. The letter was addressed to Sci-Fi. It was dated 6 months ago. She read it in the way you read something you're only allowed to glimpse, aware that you're being trusted with it, careful not to take more than you're being offered. The last paragraph said, in standard written with the particular construction of someone who thought first in another language, "I do not know how much time there is, and I have learned not to spend much energy worrying about this. The work is what it is. I have done what I could do. What comes after is not mine to control, only to prepare for. What I want you to know, when you read this, is that the best thing I did, not in 50 years of diplomacy, but in my life, was find the people worth trusting and trust them. The rest arranges itself." Mara looked up. The princess was watching her. "He wrote that in the 6th month of last year," Sci-Fi said, "before he knew what this year would bring, before any of it." A pause. "He trusted me. And because he trusted me, I knew where to put my own trust." Her eyes were steady, and the grief in them was real and present and not being managed away, just being held alongside everything else. The rest arranged itself. They sat in the observation lounge until the station's lights cycled toward evening, and the stars outside didn't change because they never did, and the ordinary business of the inner lanes continued below them. Cargo ships moving through corridors that were still open, carrying the ordinary goods of a quadrant that was still, however imperfectly, working together. Mara finished her tea. She thought about the inspection that was technically complete and the authorization she'd extended for the testimony sessions, and about what came after testimony sessions, and about the particular quality of conversations that had no obvious ending, because they were not really conversations, but something that had found its beginning and not yet found its shape. "The liaison office," she said. "What exactly does that involve?" Sci-Fi turned from the window to look at her. The formal quality was there, and the other quality too, the one that had been present since the cell but was more visible now, or less hidden, or simply had more room. "It involves," she said, "the work my great-uncle spent 50 years doing. Done differently with different people in different rooms but toward the same direction." A pause. "It involves considerable patience and occasional operational improvisation." Another pause. "And probably at some point further walls." "I'm good with walls," Mara said. "I know," said the princess. "That was the whole point." Outside, the stars went on as they always had, burning at distances that made most things feel small. But some things were the opposite of small. Some things were exactly the right size to matter, and went on mattering and kept going the way confident water keeps going, not because it is forced, but because it has found its direction, and the direction is clear. Mara set down her cup. She was ready for what came next.